Hello, and thank you for coming to this talk about one of our country's finest photographers, Julia Margaret Cameron. Julia's story is one of patience, which is apt for someone who practiced such a delicate, time-consuming art. The time and skill it takes to prepare a glass plate negative, expose it for the correct amount of time in the correct amount of light in front of a subject who does not move, then develop the plate before drying it without cracking it, glazing, then printing from it is tremendous. For someone who was a pioneer in photography as an art form, her career was brief and late in life. However, the years leading up to her first camera and the people she met along the way all contributed to the bright and glorious images she produced in her 15 years of photography. So it seems a funny place to start, but we begin Julia Margaret Cameron's story in 18th century France at the court of Marie Antoinette. Julia's grandfather was a handsome young officer in the royal court, Chevalier Ambrose Pierre Antoine de la Tange, who loved the Queen very much, possibly too much, as he was exiled to colonial India with a miniature of the Queen in his breast pocket and strict instructions never to return to Versailles. As it turns out, this exile might well have saved the young man's life, as he escaped the ensuing revolution. Instead, Ambrose became a respected equine vet and ran a riding school for the Nawab of Oud. He married Therese Grincourt, a girl from a French family that had long since seen their native land, but she longed to see France. Possibly the stories her husband told her of the old days of Versailles stoked her desire to see such a magical place. Her marriage to the Chevalier finally enabled her to travel, and after giving birth to 2 sons and 3 daughters, Therese left her husband and took the 3 girls to live in France in the shadow of Versailles opposite the cathedral. All 3 girls, who were named Julia, Adeline and Virginie, names that you'll become very familiar with, were trained by their mother to be good colonial wives. All 3 subsequently married Englishmen who were in some way connected to the colonies. The least stable and most notorious of these marriages was Adeline's marriage to James Pattle, otherwise known as Jim Blazes. He features in many people's memoirs as obviously once met, never forgotten. He is recorded as big a scamp as you ever saw and a bad fellow in every way, and the biggest liar in India. He was charismatic, charming, alcoholic and philandering, who Adeline always forgave. One of Pattle's biggest achievements was to win a campaign to ensure regular and safe steamships between Bengal and England. This meant his wife could often be absent, visiting family in England and France, and his daughters could be educated by their grandmother at Versailles. The couple had 10 children, 3 of whom did not live beyond infancy. The 7 girls who remained split their time between India and France, being barely educated beyond wifely virtues. For the middle daughter, Julia Margaret Pattle, this was not enough, and she longed for further education beyond cooking and needlework. If she was unstimulated in France, the heat and humidity in India left her ill. In 1836, it was decided that for the good of her health, especially her lungs, she should be sent to recuperate at the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa, where she met 2 men who were to change her life forever. The astronomer John Herschel and his wife Margaret were at the Cape to survey the skies of the southern hemisphere. He had installed a 21-foot telescope at the observatory near Table Mountain. Also staying at the Cape for the good of his health was Charles Hay Cameron. Eton-educated and at school with Byron, Cameron was a writer and had worked on the Indian Penal Code in Calcutta. Herschel and Cameron had become firm friends, exchanging books and views. Into their lives came Julia, introduced by a relative of her brother-in-law, Toby Prinsep. Julia found 2 educated men who seemed to take her intelligence and thirst for knowledge very seriously. She fell in love with Cameron, 20 years her senior, but from Herschel she developed a passion for lenses and capturing an image forever. Herschel would remain a close friend of the couple, corresponding with Julia over photography for the rest of their lives. Julia's son, Henry Herschel Hay Cameron, would become a photographer just like his mother. When Julia and Cameron returned to India from the Cape at the beginning of 1838, the couple were married, and Julia began her life as a colonial wife. The Camerons lived in Calcutta for a decade, during which time 4 of their 6 children were born. Like Julia and her mother before her, the Cameron children were also sent to relatives, this time in England, for their education and health. Julia and Charles Cameron's own departure from India came after the deaths of her parents, which were suitably extraordinary and scandalous. James Pattle's drinking finally caught up with him, and he died in 1845. He had left instructions for his body to be taken back to England, and the night before the family were to set sail, his wife heard a tremendous crash in the room next to her bedroom. On investigating, she found her husband stood bolt upright, having burst from his coffin. The shock was too much for the poor woman, who died a matter of weeks later. James Pattle's body was then encased in a brandy barrel and placed aboard a ship bound for England. Unfortunately, no one had told the sailors what the brandy barrel contained, and they tapped the cask for their own enjoyment. The barrel leaked and caused a fire, scuppering the boat. It was said by society in Calcutta that Pattle had been such a scamp the devil wouldn't let him leave. As a side note, although salacious and probably slightly apocryphal, these Gothic events may well have influenced Julia's imagination. She translated the poem Leonora in 1847 about a girl who waits for her lover to come back and is eventually claimed by her ghost bridegroom who takes her to her bridal grave. Further to this, she had no fear in photographing the dying and the dead. As the writer Philip Stanhope Worsley lay dying in Freshwater, Julia both nursed and photographed him just before his death in 1866. More extreme to the modern eye, after the death of her niece in Dimbola Lodge, Julia photographed the body of the little girl surrounded by flowers in an upstairs room. When Charles Cameron retired in 1848, the couple were able to join their children in England. Launched upon English society, Julia, who adored to play hostess, cut a strange and exotic figure. Dressed in flowing red velvet and Indian shawls with much silver jewellery, she would lavish gifts upon her friends, leaving them both despairing and delighted in equal amounts. The Camerons first lived in Tunbridge Wells, where Julia became lifelong friends with the poet Henry Taylor. One night, while staying with them, Julia decided she would completely redecorate the room she was in, waking her hosts in the morning to show them her handiwork. When the Taylors moved closer to London, they encouraged Julia to follow, and it was at the Taylors' new home in Mortlake that Julia met Alfred and Emily Tennyson. Her relationship with these 2 great men of literature would prove a great source of inspiration when she began her own career in art, but still that was not yet. She had to move to a special place where she could fully explore what it meant to be an artist in a little colony of her own. Charles Cameron's money that was supposed to support them for the rest of their lives was derived from his cloth coffee plantations in Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon. As the investments there thrived, he planned visits, taking the couple's eldest sons Eugene and Ewan out with him. Back at home, Cameron's eldest daughter Julie gave birth to their first granddaughter. With her children growing up, marrying and having lives of their own, Julia found herself lonely and redundant. Just when she was feeling at her lowest, the Tennysons invited Julia to visit their new home, Farringford, at Freshwater on the Isle of Wight. Julia was very much taken with the peace, the scenery and the people of the village, and so secured 2 houses linked by a central tower that were close to the Tennysons. And in autumn of 1860, Julia Margaret Cameron moved to the Isle of Wight. Dimbola Lodge was the name given to the right-hand building, named after the valley of one of Cameron's coffee plantations. The left-hand building, named Sunnyside, was where Julia's frequent guests stayed. Julia cultivated a circle of artistic friends, including the artist George Frederick Watts, Lewis Carroll and the photographer Oscar Raylander, who she persuaded to come to the Isle of Wight in 1863. Julia had met Raylander, a Swedish photographer who had moved to England to pursue his craft, through her sister Sarah, and it was to him she turned with a very odd request. The Camerons were always struggling with money, and Julia had read that silver could be extracted from waste photographic solutions. She gathered up a dozen pots and took a cab over to Raylander's studio, demanding to be told how to manage it. Raylander had to break it to her that it was almost impossible, and even if she achieved it, it would not be enough to even pay for the carriage ride to his house. Raylander came to the Isle of Wight ostensibly to photograph Tennyson, the poet laureate, but while there he also took a series of charming studies of village life around the Cameron household, known as Idylls of the Village. Julia paid for the photographs and assisted Raylander in his work, both taking the images and then developing them. At Christmas the same year, Julie, her daughter, presented her mother with a camera of her own with the words, "It may amuse you, mother, to try and photograph during your solitude at Freshwater." From that point, her career in photography began. In the background of the photograph, you can see a glass house, which had originally contained hens. The hens were liberated, and Julia hoped not too many eaten by foxes, and it became her studio in order to catch enough light for her images. The coal house was made into a dark room, and the back garden of Dimbola Lodge became a hive of activity. As guests lamented on their visits, there were no set meal times. Maids were often too busy modelling or developing the images to answer the door or serve the food, but still, the most wonderful art was being created. In Julia's short autobiography, Annals of My Glass House, she implies that she had never seen or used a camera before she was 48. This is not true, but what is remarkable is that at the age of 48, with only her maids to help her, Julie threw herself into taking photographs. The physical effort and luck involved in creating one good image was incredible, and she wrote about the struggle to capture her first successful photograph of 7-year-old Annie Philpott, who was on holiday on the island at the time. Julia would become famous for her images of children, but she wrote about the main problem of using them as models after attempting an image of Annie with her cousin Daisy. I was about halfway through a beautiful picture when a splutter of laughter from one of the children lost me that picture. Annie was persuaded to sit alone, and a successful image was finally achieved. On the card that accompanied the print given to Annie's father, Julia recorded, "The process was begun at 1 p.m. and finished at 8 p.m, showing 7 hours work to capture, develop and print one image." Now she had mastered the technique, a flurry of images of children came from her darkroom. Local children, the Keown sisters, and Freddie Gould, Lionel Tennyson, and her own grandchildren appear in classical roles such as Circe and Paul and Virginia, or in more aesthetic subjects such as the red and white roses. Julia's love of children could be given full vent as she became mother to all of her photographs, even if she had to terrify some of her tiny models in order to get a decent still image. If Julia's motherliness was an inspiration, then so was her religious devotion, and like many artists of her era, Julia created many images from the Bible, including a series on Christian values. Her speciality became images of the Virgin Mary, hovering over a Christ child, often sleeping. One model who became linked with these images was Mary Hillier. Mary came into Julia's life as a 14-year-old freshwater girl, delivering a message to Dimbola Lodge. The moment Julia saw Mary, she apparently offered her work on account of her beauty. Mary's career as Julia's model lasted the same length as her career as Julia's devoted maid until the Camerons left Freshwater in 1875. Through Mary, Julia was able to express the divine nature of motherhood as she became the iconic protectress of children, holy and otherwise. Some of the most iconic images of Mary also show some of the remarkable and unusual techniques that Julia employed or allowed to exist on her finished works, many of which she was criticised for. Note the cracking on the top of this image. Photography at the time was used mainly to record, and any pretense of art was done through the staging of the photographs. Julia went further, playing with focus, keeping cracks in the glaze, and even marking and damaging the negatives deliberately. Her lack of focus was often criticised by the other photographers and reviewers. The Photographic News wrote rather harshly that her images were smudged, torn, dirty, undefined, and in some cases almost unreadable. There is hardly one of them that ought to have been washed off the plate as soon as it had appeared. However, the London Illustrated News saw her efforts somewhat differently, writing that her work was the nearest approach to art, or rather, the most bold and successful application of the principles of fine art to photography. One particularly striking example of her intervention in the process went on to inspire one of the most well-respected artists of the era. In this photograph of the Holy Family, Mary holds two little girls representing Christ and St. John. It wasn't unusual for her to cast a beautiful little girl or young woman as a male historical figure. Above Mary's head, Julia scratched a halo. George Frederick Watts was so struck by this image that he based his 1898 painting Charity on it. Another of Julia's maids who appears in these biblical scenes was another Mary, Mary Ryan. Her entry into Julia's life was by chance, when Julia was living in London. She was walking on Putney Heath when she came across an Irish woman and her young daughter, starving and begging. Julia immediately took the young child, Mary, into her home and found work for Mrs. Ryan. Mary Ryan, then 10 years old, found herself educated alongside Julia's young sons, much to the astonishment of Julia's friends, as one wrote of Mary, "What will become of her? If she is to be a good servant, I'm afraid there is no such thing as a good servant who is fond of reading." Julia's actions in educating her beggar maid seem eccentric to Victorian society, but ultimately succeeded when the beautiful Irish girl was spotted in one of the photographs by Henry Cotton, later Lord Cotton, who married her, making her Lady Cotton. Julia celebrated by photographing the couple shortly before their wedding as Romeo and Juliet. Julia once allegedly said that she refused to photograph any woman over the age of 18, and although that isn't true, you can see how people were willing to believe that from the vast swathes of beautiful and striking young women who posed for her. Daughter of Julia's sister Mia, Julia Prinsep Jackson was a society artist model as well as a writer. She is probably best known today as the mother of Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. Married twice, a mother to 7 children, her privileged yet unhappy life left its toll on her face, seen clearly in Julia's photographs over the years as she turns from a winsome young woman into a grieving widow. Julia Jackson wasn't the only family member in whom Julia found inspiration. May Prinsep was the niece of Julia's sister Sarah Prinsep and came to live with her family after the death of her father in 1864. Beautiful and patient, May sat for many photographs, some on her own and some alongside the maids. In this image, the dialogue, May Prinsep poses beside Mary Hillier. Within her photography, Julia was a great class leveller, dressing maids as queens and putting duchesses in the same dresses that the maids had worn. It would be a hard task to see from her photographs which is the servant and which is the lady, and the equal status of the two girls in the dialogue seems to express that ideal of equality as well. May also modelled for the artist George Frederick Watts, with whom she formed a lifelong friendship, and when she married, moved to live beside Watts and his wife. They were also buried close together at Compton in Surrey. If Julia found inspiration in the beauty of young women in her circle, then so too was her admiration and hero worship of great men. In photography, she was able to capture now iconic images of some of the most respected men of her age, most of whom she counted as friends. Henry Taylor was a willing subject of many images, and Julia recorded in her autobiography, "Regardless of the possible dread that sitting to my fancy might be making a fool of himself, he consented to be my Friar Lawrence with Juliet, Prospero with Miranda, to hold my poker as his sceptre and do whatever I desired of him." Likewise, her husband Charles could be called upon to play roles in some of the more theatrical images, including King Lear allotting his kingdom to his 3 daughters, where he is surrounded by the Liddell sisters, who were on holiday at the time. Alice Liddell, of Alice in Wonderland fame, is to his right. He is also posed for the almost risque image of Vivian and Merlin, with the beautiful young sorceress beguiling the elderly wizard, entwining her fingers in Cameron's silvery beard. Julia's adoration of her elderly husband was a subject of fond humour among her friends, and one guest at Freshwater recorded how they had been brought upstairs where Charles had been sleeping. Julia announced proudly, "Behold, the most beautiful old man on earth." A man who could not be persuaded to put on an act for his photographs was the poet laureate and neighbour of Freshwater, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Nevertheless, he sat for some of the most interesting photographs, which have a more intimate quality than the more official portraits that were captured. Through Tennyson, Julia was able to gain inspiration from his poems, drawing time and time again on his works. A final large-scale project for her in 1875 was to create an illustrated volume of his poems accompanied by her photographs. When she had allowed one of her pictures, a photograph of Mary Hillier as Maud, to be engraved for a cabinet edition of the poet's work, she was disappointed with the tiny result. Instead, Julia planned and executed a large-scale folio based on Tennyson's series of Arthurian poems, The Idylls of the King. Of all her photographs, these probably look the most dated to modern audiences due to the number of props and a faint whiff of amateur dramatics. However, the ambition and effort that these pictures represent is breathtaking. Dimbola Lodge was host to some of the most famous and unusual celebrities of the 1860s. Charles Darwin and his family stayed in Sunnyside during their visit to the island, and Julia took one of the most iconic images of him. The whole Darwin family was won over by Julia's enthusiasm and affection, with Darwin's elderly brother calling over the stairs to her, "You have left 8 persons deeply in love with you." Undoubtedly the most unusual visitor to Julia's studio was Prince Didac Al-Amado, the son of the King of Abyssinia. He had been taken into the custody of the British after a colonial war that had left him an orphan. He had been left in the care of Captain Tristram Speedy, who had taken him to see the Queen in her Isle of Wight home, Osborne House. When he was brought to meet Tennyson and Darwin at Freshwater, Julia took the opportunity to take a number of images of the little prince, who played with her other guests and did not mind having his photograph taken. Captain Speedy, on the other hand, grumbled. Unfortunately for the Camerons, the coffee plantations were not providing the retirement fund that they needed to support households both in Sri Lanka and Freshwater. Coffee leaf rust made a sudden and terrible appearance in 1869 and wiped out vast swathes of plantation in just a few years. 80-year-old Charles Cameron found himself constantly journeying to and from to the detriment of his health, and decided he wanted his plantation to be his final resting place. The couple's sons were settled in the colonies, and Julia's own health suffered as she was constantly parted from her beloved family. The decision was made to move to Sri Lanka in 1875. When the couple departed from Southampton, fearing that either one of them could die on the voyage, Julia took 2 coffins. Optimistically, she also took a cow for fresh milk, so she obviously thought there was a chance of surviving the trip. Once settled back in the Highland plantation in the mountains in the south of Sri Lanka, Julia lost no time in capturing the beauty of her workers and making narrative pieces about their lives. She kept on a gardener, even though she had no actual garden for him to tend, but she declared his back was superb. It is possible to see in her Sri Lankan images echoes of her former works, with her crop pickers taking on the Tennysonian roles formerly played by her maids. She was also visited by the artist Marianne North, who she photographed painting on the veranda of their home. In her memoirs, North remembered posing for Julia. "She made me stand with the spiky coconut branches running into my head and told me to look perfectly natural." In a characteristic act of generosity, when North admired Julia's shawl, Julia immediately fetched a pair of scissors and cut it in half so they both could wear it. Ever the hostess, when North left the Cameron household, Julia got a party together to escort the artist down the hill and wait with her for her midnight coach. Julia was content to be with her beloved sons once more, but she missed her family and friends back in England, expressed in one of her last letters home, "Let me throw my arms of memory around you all, and if arms of memory, they must be arms of love." In the January of 1879, while staying with her youngest son, Julia fell ill. Her sick bed was moved so she could see the night sky. She whispered the word "beautiful" and died, aged 64. Her husband Charles, 20 years her senior, only outlived her by a year. The couple are buried together at St Mary's Churchyard, Glen Cairn, Decoya, not far from their plantation, on what is still known as Cameron Land. In her brief career, she had created 900 known photographs, and possibly more are yet to be discovered. Despite being all but forgotten for the better part of the 20th century, Julia's talent and experimentation is now recognised as groundbreaking. Among the sentimental pictures of children and Bible subjects, there are images that strike viewers as impossibly modern. She wrote to a friend that she hoped her photographs should electrify you with delight and startle the world. And in her smudges, focus and brilliances, I think she achieved her aim. Thank you very much.